Welcome to Lecture 5. In this lecture, we will continue with the next stage in the nomination process. Specifically, we will discuss the confirmation voting procedure in the Senate. In recent years, the confirmation process has become increasingly contentious, with a very public battle waged between the President and the Senate over the composition of the nation's highest court. But it hasn't always been this way. Indeed, prior to the late 1980s, it seemed that senators of all ideological stripes cared most about the nominee's objective qualifications, that is, the nominee's legal competence and ethics, rather than the nominee's ideological beliefs. Yet ideological concerns rose to new heights with the infamous failed nomination of President Reagan's appointee Robert Bork in 1987. So in this lecture, we'll talk about the variables that systematically influence the confirmation voting behavior of senators, taking a good hard look at the impact of ideology in the post-Bork era and the implications for future vacancies on the Supreme Court. Since this is the third lecture in a series of related steps, let's step back to review briefly. The process starts when a vacancy occurs on the Supreme Court. In this stage, we talked about the motivations of the justices. Why do justices leave the court when they do? Recall that today, most justices choose to leave the Supreme Court through voluntary retirement. Indeed, with the notable exceptions of Chief Justice Rehnquist's death in 2005 and Justice Scalia's death in 2016, the last time that a serving justice died in office was in the early 1950s, and it became increasingly less common, beginning really with the early 20th century. The decision to retire from the court is driven primarily by two factors. First, economic considerations provide a practical motivation for retirement. Indeed, we see a huge turnover on the court once justices are eligible for the generous pension package in retirement. Put another way, we expect that justices will hang on to their seats at least until they are eligible for the judicial pension. Second, justices have proven themselves to be strategic political actors. Lots of qualitative evidence reveals that justices try to hang on to their seats until a president is of their own political party. Basically, the justices want someone like them to take their vacated seat. Then once the vacancy occurs, the president and his advisors get to work to name a new nominee to the court. During this stage of the game, we're particularly concerned with what motivates the president to select a particular nominee. While there are certainly a myriad of factors that influence this decision, including demographic considerations and so forth, there's overwhelming evidence that the primary consideration for a president's selection is the ideological compatibility between the president and the potential nominee. This, of course, should not be surprising, since the president wants to appoint someone to the bench who will continue to carry out his policy goals long after he leaves office. Remember, however, that the president cannot act entirely unconstrained and is always aware that the selected nominee must muster enough votes to survive the confirmation vote in Congress. Thus, depending on the partisan makeup of the Senate, sometimes a president faces major institutional constraints, and the nominee selection is a reflection of this. Today we'll talk more fully about this institutional constraint, this time shifting our focus to emphasize the motivations of senators during the confirmation process. In doing so, we'll answer several questions, like what factors influence a senator's confirmation decision? What hurdles must a nominee clear to successfully be confirmed by the Senate? In particular, we'll spend some time talking about the filibuster and how that impacts or doesn't impact the process. We'll think about how we as political scientists measure the things that we theoretically think ought to influence the Senate's choice. And we'll discuss how some variables that affect a senator's decision have changed over time. Before we get into the meat of the lecture, however, it's important to understand a few basic procedural issues. First of all, judicial nominees are confirmed by a simple majority. This means that only 50% plus one of the total number of senators present during a confirmation vote need to vote in favor of a particular nominee's appointment. So, for example, if we assume that all 100 senators are present, a nominee would be successfully confirmed with a minimum of 51 votes. While this bare minimum seems like it might be easy to reach, it's important to note that the filibuster can be used against judicial nominations. A filibuster is a tactic that the minority party in the Senate employs to postpone or prevent a vote from occurring by keeping debate open. Essentially, filibusters occur because there are no time limits on the amount of debate. So senators who oppose a judicial nominee can just keep right on talking, stalling the vote indefinitely. The filibuster has been around almost since the nation's inception, and until 1917, there wasn't anything anyone could do to stop the use of the filibuster or to delay or prevent the floor vote. Then in 1917, the Senate changed its rules and implemented Rule 22, which said that 2/3 of the members present could invoke something called cloture, which puts an official end to the debate, forcing a vote on the issue. Then in 1949, the Senate changed its rules again, mandating that 2/3 of the entire Senate, not just those present during debates, were needed to invoke cloture to end the filibuster. This meant that at least 67 senators were needed for cloture. This system only lasted until 1959, when the Senate reverted to the 2/3 of the Senate present during debate rule. Finally, in 1975, the results shifted for a final time, making 3/5 or 60 votes of the entire Senate necessary for cloture. This is the system that remains in place today. So, what does this mean in basic terms? It means that a strong minority presence in the Senate, consisting of at least 41 members, can keep debate open, causing a sizable delay or entirely stalling the judicial confirmation process. The use of the filibuster during judicial confirmations came to a head in 2005 when Senate Democrats used the filibuster to block confirmation votes on 10 of President George W. Bush's 229 nominees to the federal bench on the ground that the nominees were too extreme or too ideologically biased. Basically, the Democrats were playing dirty in retaliation for Republicans using the exact same tactic during the Clinton administration. Well, Senate Republicans were fed up with the filibuster and developed something that has come to be known as the nuclear option, which would do away with the filibuster during judicial nominations altogether. Proponents of the plan called it the constitutional option, arguing that the Constitution gives the Senate authority to make its own rules, and that a simple majority can change the rules, which was at odds with the Senate's long-standing rule that requires a 2/3 supermajority to change its own institutional rules. The two parties then engaged in a game of high-stakes chicken, debating the right to end or limit the use of the filibuster. The constitutional debate came to a close on May 23, 2005, when a group of 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats, known as the Gang of 14, agreed to compromise and diffuse tensions in the Senate. The compromise granted confirmation to 3 of Bush's 10 nominees and ensured that the filibuster would only be used under extraordinary circumstances during the judicial confirmation process. The use of the filibuster has been especially prevalent in judicial nominations in lower federal courts. Indeed, the use of the filibuster against a Supreme Court nominee is in fact pretty rare. The exception to that rarity occurred in 1968 when President Johnson nominated sitting Justice Abe Fortas to assume the position of Chief Justice. When the Senate Democrats couldn't muster enough votes to invoke cloture, Fortas's nomination was withdrawn. So that was a successful filibuster. Then again in 2006, some minority Senate Democrats called for a filibuster to try to defeat the confirmation of Justice Samuel Alito, but they were unable to garner enough support and a filibuster never happened. Likewise, there was a bit of chatter about a potential Republican filibuster over the nomination of Justice Elena Kagan, though this too never materialized. By and large, the likelihood that a Supreme Court nominee fails to pass the Senate confirmation is actually rather small. In fact, the Senate has only failed to confirm 27 out of 149 nominees to the court, which is roughly an 18% rejection rate. Put another way, nearly 4 out of 5, more than 4 out of 5 nominees are confirmed by the Senate. Though this looks like a favorable situation for nominees, the rejection rate is actually a lot higher than for other executive nominations. For example, if we look to nominations to the president's cabinet, the rejection rate is less than 2%, and if we look at presidential nominations to the rest of the federal government, the rejection rate is well below 1%. And all of those go through the same process, where the president selects a nominee to fill a particular appointment, and the Senate must confirm. So it seems as though the Senate is much more deferential to the president when the president is staffing the federal bureaucracy and selecting people to serve on his cabinet, and much more suspicious of who the president is picking to fill the federal judiciary. Additionally, there's a selection effect at work here. Remember that in the last lecture, we talked about how the president has one eye toward the Senate when he is selecting his nominee. Because of that, we should expect that most of the time the Senate is not going to vote on a truly bad nominee, because such bad nominees would be weeded out at the previous stage, at the selection or nomination stage. Remember, too, that the president is highly motivated to select a nominee that will survive the confirmation vote in the Senate, because the impact of rejection is very costly to the president politically, since it then makes the president appear to be weaker than Congress, and it might even call into question the president's own judgment if his selection is defeated. Okay, so now we know that even though most Supreme Court nominees survive the confirmation process, almost 20% of them don't. Moreover, there is variation in Senate voting across nominees. For example, on the current court, Justice Kennedy was confirmed unanimously, while Justice Stephen Breyer garnered only 87 votes in favor of his confirmation. 9 senators voted against. And the confirmations of Justices Samuel Alito and Elena Kagan and Justice Gorsuch were much closer, with a 58 to 42 split for Alito and a 63 to 37 split for Justice Kagan, for example. So what we want to know is what explains this variation. In other words, what factors influence a Senate to vote for or against a particular Supreme Court nominee? To answer this question, let's think about it empirically. In particular, we'll follow the example of a 2006 study conducted by political scientists Lee Epstein, Renee Lindstadt, Jeff Segal, and Chad Westerland, which extends an older 1989 seminal study by political scientists Chuck Cameron, Albert Cover, and Jeff Segal. Both of these studies define the dependent variable as a senator's vote, as yay or nay, yay in favor of, nay against confirmation. Recall that the dependent variable is the variable whose variation we are trying to explain. So again, here we want to understand what causes senators to vote the way they do. Political science research suggests that several factors might influence how a senator votes. First, it certainly makes sense that senators care about the nominee's objective qualifications, like the nominee's legal training, their competence in constitutional law, and the person's personal ethics and integrity. Second, just like the president cares about the direction of the Supreme Court and wants a nominee who reflects his or her ideological beliefs, so too do members of Congress care about the ideological predispositions of the nominee. In particular, if we assume that senators are primarily motivated by re-election concerns, a given senator would prefer that a nominee reflects the values of his or her constituents. In short, a liberal senator is more likely to support a liberal nominee and a conservative senator a conservative nominee. Third, how much weight a senator places on the nominee's objective qualifications might very well be weighted by their ideological compatibility. In other words, if a senator and a nominee are ideologically compatible, the senator might care more about ideology and less about qualifications, or let those lesser qualifications sort of slide because ideology compensates for those lack of qualifications. Alternately, if the two are ideologically mismatched, the senator might place a greater emphasis on objective qualifications. Fourth, theory suggests that characteristics of the president might also shape senatorial behavior. In particular, a strong president is better able to deploy the resources afforded to his office when his party controls the Senate, and the president is not in his 4th year, at which point the president is deemed to be vulnerable to re-election concerns, or if the president is in his 8th year and is no longer going to stand for re-election. Okay, so this is sort of the inverse of what we talked about in the last lecture, that when the president is weak relative to Congress or doesn't have a lot of popular support, then he's more likely to take suggestions from Senate leadership in selecting a nominee for the office in the first place. And theory here is telling us that when we have a strong president who has more control over government because the Senate is controlled by his same party. So if the president is a Democrat, then the Senate is also Democrat, or Republican and Republican, and the president is not up for re-election or on his way out, then the president might be in a more powerful position, able to muster public support in favor of his nominees, so the Senate might be more in tune to what the president is doing and therefore influenced by the strength of the presidential office. Finally, because of party loyalty, simple partisan agreement between the senator and the president could indicate a greater willingness for the senator to support the president's pick. Well, it's easy to ascertain whether the president is politically strong or whether the senator and the president are of the same party. It's far more difficult to quantitatively measure a nominee's qualifications or ideological beliefs. And yet, if we want to determine their systematic impact on voting behavior in the Senate, we need to develop a strategy that can be used across nominees throughout time. But this is really hard to do because nominees come from very diverse backgrounds. So we might want to simply look at a potential justice's past behavior. Not all justices have the same type of past behavior because not all justices come from the same place or have the same judicial experience. For example, former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor served in a state legislature, and Elena Kagan had never been a judge, while Ruth Bader Ginsburg served on both the Federal District Court and a Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. So how would we compare these three female justices? They all have very different backgrounds. So to develop measures of both the nominee's perceived qualifications and a quantitative measure of the incoming nominee's perceived ideology, the solution proposed by political scientists in the late 1980s was to look at newspaper editorials from the time that the nomination is announced to the time of the confirmation vote. Newspaper editorials are one of the few sources of information that contain comparable data on each justice. Named for its founders, the Segal cover scores provide a standardized measure of Supreme Court nominees' perceived qualifications and ideology from 1937 to the present. To create the standardized scores, the scholars conducted content analysis of editorials from 4 leading newspapers, 2 with a liberal slant, the New York Times and the Washington Post, and 2 with a more conservative outlook, the Chicago Tribune and the Los Angeles Times. For each editorial, the researchers and their research assistants would code each paragraph as liberal, moderate, or conservative for ideology. They developed a similar scale to code for qualifications. This slide gives an example of an editorial from the New York Times after Elena Kagan had been nominated to the court, but before the Senate vote on her confirmation. In the first paragraph, the author notes Kagan's perceived ideological moderation, saying that she is an unorthodox thinker who defies ideological categories. But in the second paragraph, the author comments on Kagan's support for the free speech of citizens, which is typically associated with the liberal ideological perspective. So if we were to code that together, we would code the first paragraph as being moderate, the second paragraph as being liberal. Here's another example from a New York Times editorial, this time for Sonia Sotomayor in 2009, again after President Obama nominated her to the court, but before the Senate confirmation vote. Unlike the last example, this isn't ambiguous at all, with the author calling Sonia Sotomayor quite liberal. It is from statements like these that scholars have been able to develop standardized, quantifiable measures of qualifications and ideology, which are 2 really slippery ideas. And in doing so, we now have a way to look at how these factors systematically influence the voting behavior of senators during the confirmation process. This graph plots the ideology of the nominee against the nominee's perceived qualifications. You'll notice that the vast majority of nominees, both liberal and conservative, have been extraordinarily well qualified for the position on the court. For example, conservative Justice Scalia, moderate Justice O'Connor, and liberal Justice Brennan all achieved the highest possible score for objective qualifications. On the other end of the spectrum, conservative G. Harold Carswell, a Nixon nominee, received the lowest qualification score. And of course, Carswell's nomination is ultimately rejected by the Senate. This graph plots the number of nay votes a nominee receives against the qualification score. You'll notice a very steep downward trend in the red line, which shows that nominees that are not well qualified receive a higher proportion of nay votes than nominees who are objectively well qualified to serve on the Supreme Court. Notice, in fact, the cluster of points in the bottom right-hand corner. This reveals that, at least historically, most qualified nominees receive very few nay votes. The pattern on this graph might be a bit more difficult to discern. In this graph, the number of nay votes is plotted against the ideology of the nominee. What you should notice is the sort of U-shaped pattern that emerges, where nominees on either end of the poll, that is those who are extremely conservative or those who are extremely liberal, so the extremely liberal, the left-right pendulum here, those who are extremely conservative or extremely liberal receive a higher proportion of nay votes. The Supreme Court nominees with relatively moderate ideological beliefs, on the other hand, so those sort of in the middle here, receive the lowest proportion of nay votes. Okay, as a quick reminder, recall that there are 5 distinct independent variables that we said could determine why a senator votes for or against the confirmation of a Supreme Court nominee. Once again, they are the qualifications of the nominee, the ideology of the nominee, the interaction between qualifications and ideological compatibility between the senator and the nominee, and the last 2 variables assess presidential influence. The 4th considers the strength of the president, and the 5th controls for party agreement between the senator and the president. Recall, too, that most nominees are confirmed by the Senate, and often by large majorities within the Senate. Well, in the 1980s, something seemed to change. First, in 1986, President Reagan nominated extremely conservative Justice Nino Scalia to the Supreme Court. Scalia was widely perceived to be well qualified for the position. And interestingly, despite his known and measurable extreme conservatism, Scalia is confirmed in a unanimous Senate vote. Just 1 year later, President Reagan had another vacancy to fill. This time, he nominated Robert Bork. Like Scalia, Bork is extremely conservative, and also like Scalia, Bork was especially well qualified for the job. But unlike Scalia, Bork's nomination was soundly rejected by the Senate, which had come under Democratic control. In the end, only 42 senators voted in favor of Bork's confirmation, while the remaining 58 voted against. This is an important case study for a lot of reasons. First, it shows the importance of the partisan split. In 1986, the Republicans controlled both the presidency and the Senate. A year later, the Democrats swept the Senate, and polarization between the parties became a central focus. Second, we saw increased participation of both the media and interest groups in the confirmation proceedings, which is something we'll talk about later this semester. This was much more of a public battle, with more voices entering the political landscape. Third, by the time that Bork was nominated to the court, Reagan was politically weakening as he was about to enter the last year of his term as president. Do these things sound familiar? It should sound eerily reminiscent of the political landscape that we saw just in 2016 when President Obama was in fact a lame duck president with less than a year left in his term, and Justice Scalia unexpectedly left a vacancy on the Supreme Court. We were in the middle of presidential campaign season, so we were witnessing intense media scrutiny and incredible involvement of interest groups. So we saw history sort of repeating itself. So in some ways, the current climate is unique, but in other ways, it's not entirely unprecedented. Indeed, since Bork's failed nomination, the confirmation for all subsequent nominees has been especially contentious. It seemed that the 1987 battle ushered in a new era of partisan politics in the Senate, where ideology and politics reigned supreme, and considerations of a nominee's qualifications, ethics, and character appeared to no longer matter. Consider President George W. Bush's nomination of John Roberts to the court in 2005 for a moment. Even Senate Democrats praised his outstanding legal qualifications. There was no doubt that Roberts has a keen legal mind, that he was well qualified and equipped for the job. His personal integrity and ethics were beyond reproach. But Senate Democrats simultaneously claimed that they would subject Roberts to tough questions about his political views, and in the end, 22 Democrats voted against Roberts' confirmation. So why is all of that? That's what we want to understand. What happened? So what accounts for these variations in confirmation voting? Could it be that presidential strength or party agreement between the president and the senator account for voting differences? Or is it all about the nominee's qualifications and ideology? And what does Bork's failed nomination have to do with anything? We'll answer all of those questions now. Let's first look at presidential strength. Statistical analysis reveals that when the president is strong, which means that his party controls the Senate and he's not in his fourth year, the probability that a senator votes to confirm the nominee is 0.99. This means that almost always we should expect a senator to vote to confirm a nominee when there's a strong president. But what about when the president is weak? Well, the probability is virtually indistinguishable from that of a strong president. In fact, if the president is weak, a senator will vote to confirm the nominee with a 0.97 probability. Thus, presidential strength doesn't seem to have a lot of explanatory power when we control for all of the other variables in the model. In other words, whether the president is politically strong or politically weak, it doesn't seem to matter to influence whether or not a senator votes to confirm. What about party agreement? The same sort of pattern emerges. If the senator is of the same political party as the president, the likelihood that the senator votes to confirm a nominee is 0.99. Even when the president and senator are of different or opposing parties, we still see that the probability to confirm is ridiculously high. It is quite clear then that presidential strength and party agreement are not what drive a senator's voting decision when we control for ideology and qualifications and the interaction between the two. So let's turn now to look at the effect of nominee qualifications and ideology to see if we might better understand what determines how a senator votes. In the graphs that we looked at earlier in this lecture, we saw that well-qualified nominees receive far less nay votes than their unqualified counterparts. This graph, which shows Senate voting behavior before the failed Bork nomination, confirms this assertion. I know this graph is a bit difficult to read, so let's walk through it slowly. The x-axis aligns nominees from most qualified on the left to least qualified on the right, while the y-axis captures the ideological distance between a nominee and a voting senator, from lowest on the bottom to highest on the top. So that means that if there's low ideological distance at the bottom of the graph, like the left-hand bottom corner, that means that we've got a well-qualified nominee who is really close ideologically to a voting senator. So they're ideological allies. As we move up the y-axis, the ideological distance grows and they become ideological opponents. The shades of blue indicate the probability of a yay vote. So the darkest blue means that we expect with almost 100% certainty that a senator will vote yay to confirm, and white means that we expect there's a 0% chance a senator will vote to confirm the nominee. So in this graph, looking at the leftmost region, we see that the most well-qualified nominees are almost certain to be confirmed in near unanimous decisions because all senators, regardless of their own personal ideology or how far away they are from the nominee, are likely to vote to confirm. The curvilinear shape of the lines shows that as you move down the spectrum of qualifications, ideology starts to matter more. As long as the senator is ideologically close to the nominee or has low ideological distance, the senator is still inclined to cast a vote in favor of that nominee until the lack of qualifications becomes too hard to ignore. Indeed, the least qualified nominees stand very little chance to survive the confirmation process in the Senate. If you think about it another way, qualifications matter a lot when there's a sizable or high ideological distance between a senator and nominee. But the takeaway point from this graph is that before Bork's nomination, perceived qualifications carried a lot of weight. Senators across the ideological spectrum were highly likely to vote to confirm the most well-qualified Supreme Court nominees. After Bork's nomination, we see a stark contrast in voting behavior in the Senate. For the nominations post-Bork, even the most well-qualified nominees can't seem to overcome the ideological divide. Notice again the leftmost portion of the graph. The bottom left-hand corner shows that when there's low ideological distance between a voting senator and the nominee, and when that nominee is well qualified, the senator will almost certainly vote to confirm. But as we move up the y-axis, however, increasing the ideological distance between the nominee and the voting senator, the likelihood of a yay vote decreases to almost zero. So in short, in the aftermath of the Bork nomination, ideology matters a lot. This slide presents a side-by-side comparison of the shift in voting behavior pre- and post-Bork. The effect of ideology on a senator's voting decision is far greater in the post-Bork era than before. Before the failed nomination in 1987, a well-qualified nominee was unlikely to face a confirmation battle in the Senate. In today's polarized Congress, it is more likely that any Supreme Court nominee, regardless of qualifications, will face a bitter partisan battle. Even a well-qualified nominee who is only moderately ideologically distant from a senator will face an uphill battle, compared with 30 years ago, when a well-qualified nominee would sail through the confirmation process. In this lecture, we set out to determine why some senators vote for nominees but not for others. We learned that presidential strength and party agreement are not major factors in a senator's voting choice, explaining very little of, if any, of the variability in individual senators' choices. But qualifications do matter. Specifically, well-qualified nominees are rarely defeated. Additionally, the probability that any given senator votes in favor of a nominee is higher if that nominee has strong legal education and has demonstrated ability that he or she is well suited for the job. Ideological compatibility matters too. A senator is more likely to cast a yay vote if a nominee is ideologically proximate to the senator's own preferences. Finally, the Bork effect shows that the influence of qualifications is contingent on a senator's ideological distance from the nominee. In the post-Bork era, qualifications no longer make up for the ideological distance. As a final note, some scholars have pointed out that the ideological voting in the Senate actually started as far back as the nomination of Bill Brennan in the 1950s, and they aren't wrong. Indeed, as Congress has become more polarized, especially since the 1960s onward, we've seen far more contentious confirmation battles in the Senate. But Bork's failed nomination still stands apart as a break in history, where ideology clearly trumps the qualifications of the nominee. The Bork saga has changed the way we do confirmations now, increasing interest group turnout in support for and against a nominee and making the paper trail of potential nominees far more dangerous than in the past.